Bullies pick on a newcomer, big mistake. He's an unstoppable fighter. What would you do if you were humiliated every day but had a secret that could turn the tables? And what if those who underestimated you were about to learn the most painful lesson of their lives? This is the story of Jake, a boy who moves to a new town and quickly becomes the target of the school's bullies. What they don't know is that they're messing with the wrong person. What starts as just another case of bullying soon turns into a shocking reality check that no one saw coming. Get ready for a story of revenge, redemption, and a plot twist that will leave you breathless. The small town of Brookside was never a busy place. The same people followed the same routines day after day. Everyone knew each other, and any newcomer quickly became the talk of the town. So when a new kid showed up at school, rumors spread instantly. He was tall but not overly muscular. He wore simple dark clothes and had a calm, almost indifferent gaze. His name? Jake. Jake didn't try to make friends. He chose a quiet seat at the back of the class, spoke only when necessary, and avoided any kind of conflict. But ironically, that attracted the wrong kind of attention at Brookside High. There was a group that acted like they owned the place, led by Troy, an arrogant athlete, and the coaches. The Bullies had a habit of testing every new kid. They saw themselves as kings of the school and no one dared to challenge them, and Jake to them, he was just another easy target. One day in the cafeteria, Jake was sitting alone at his table when Troy and his friends approached. "Hey, new guy," Troy said, slamming his hand on the table. "Didn't see you at practice. You planning to join a team, or are you just another loser?" Jake slowly looked up, analyzing Troy and the other guys standing around him. He didn't answer right away, he just went back to eating. Calmly, the bullies exchanged glances, laughing. "Look at this. He's mute." One of Troy's friends. "Mocked, or maybe he's just a coward," another one added. The entire cafeteria watched, waiting to see how the new kid would react, but Jake didn't seem bothered at all. He simply picked up his tray and without saying a word got up and left the cafeteria. That irritated the bullies. They wanted a reaction, they wanted to see fear, but they got nothing. Troy clenched his fists, looking at his friends. "This guy thinks he can ignore us, that's not going to fly." And just like that, Jake's fate was sealed. He would become the new target of Brookside High's bullies. What Troy and his friends didn't know was that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. It didn't take long for Troy and his friends to start testing Jake. They started small, accidentally bumping into him in the hallways, knocking his books off his desk, making sarcastic comments when he walked by. But Jake never reacted. That only made them more determined. One afternoon, as Jake was leaving the school building, he found his path blocked. Troy and his group stood in front of him, smirking. "Hey, new guy," Troy said, "cross his arms. You're a hard guy to get a reaction from, but don't worry, we'll change that." Jake stared at him, silent. His expression was unreadable. "Not much of a talker, huh?" One of Troy's friends sneered. "That's okay, we don't need words to have fun." Before Jake could step around them, another one of the bullies, a large guy named Mason, shoved him. It wasn't enough to knock him down, just enough to test him. Jake staggered slightly but quickly regained his balance. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't even look angry. That annoyed Troy. "What's wrong?" Troy taunted. "You scared? Or do you think you're too good to fight back?" Jake's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Troy chuckled. "That's what I thought. Just another coward, satisfied that they had put Jake in his place." The group laughed and walked away, but they had no idea Jake hadn't reacted. Not because he was scared, but because he knew exactly what he was capable of. He had spent years training, honing his skills. He could have ended that confrontation in seconds, but not yet. They weren't worth it. Not yet. The bullying didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. Troy and his friends became more aggressive, more desperate to break Jake's silence. They tripped him in the hallways, stole his notebooks, even spread rumors about him, and still no reaction. Until one evening after school, Jake was walking home alone when he heard footsteps behind him. He knew who it was before he even turned around. Troy Mason and two of their lackeys stood behind him, grinning. "Hey, new guy," Troy called out. "Where you headed? Thought we'd walk you home." Jake sighed quietly. He had hoped to avoid this. "I'm not interested," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mason scoffed. "Hear that he's not interested? Too bad, we don't care." The bullies moved in closer, circling him. Jake's eyes darted to the street. Empty. No teachers, no witnesses. Troy smirked. "You've been real quiet." Jake makes us wonder, what are you hiding? Mason lunged first, grabbing Jake's shoulder, and that's when it happened. A blur of movement too fast for them to register in one smooth motion. Jake twisted. Mason's wrist spun him around and shoved him forward. Mason lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Troy's eyes widened what the Jake turned to face them, his expression still eerily calm. "I'm done playing your game," he said. For the first time. Troy felt at unease. Jake wasn't scared of them, he never was, and something told him this was just the beginning. The next morning at school, rumors spread like wildfire. Mason had shown up with a sore wrist, and though he tried to play it off, everyone noticed the way he avoided talking about what happened. Troy and his crew were furious. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, New. Kids didn't fight back, especially not like that. Something was off about Jake Mr. Reynolds. The school's history teacher noticed the tension he had been at Brookside High for over 20 years, and he knew Troy's gang all too well. So when he overheard students whispering about an incident after school, his curiosity was piqued. Later that day, he found Jake sitting alone in the library reading. "Jake," he said, pulling up a chair, "mind if I ask you something?" Jake looked up, cautious. "Depends on what it is." Reynolds studied him. There was something about the way Jake carried himself. Controlled, disciplined. He had seen it before. "I heard about what happened with Troy and his friends." Jake said nothing. He didn't deny. It didn't confirm it. Just waited. Reynolds leaned forward. "You handled yourself well. Most kids wouldn't have been able to do what you did." "Where did you learn that?" Jake hesitated then. In a low voice he said, "My father trained me," raised an eyebrow. "Trained?" Jake nodded. "He was a professional fighter, taught me everything." He knew it all made sense now. The stance, the calm demeanor, the way he had taken down Mason without even breaking a sweat. Jake wasn't just some kid who got lucky, he'd been trained to fight. Reynolds exhaled. "Listen, Jake, I know Troy and his friends won't let this go, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about schoolyard bullying anymore." Jake met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready." What neither of them knew was that Troy had been listening outside the library door, and now he knew Jake's secret, and he had a plan. Troy was furious. Jake had humiliated them, not just in private, but now in the eyes of the whole school. And to make things worse, Jake wasn't just some random new kid. He was trained a real fighter, but Troy wasn't about to back down if Jake wanted to play tough. Then Troy would show him who really ran the school that afternoon. Troy and his gang spread the word. Something big was going down behind the gym after school. No teachers, no interruptions, just a lesson that needed to be taught. Jake heard the whispers but acted as if he didn't care. When the final bell rang, students rushed outside, forming a circle near the back of the school. The air was thick with anticipation. Jake arrived last. He wasn't surprised to see Troy Mason and 3 more of their friends waiting for him. 5 against 1. Troy smirked. "Glad you showed up?" Jake sighed. "I didn't come here to fight." Troy scoffed. "Too bad, because you don't have a choice without warning." Mason charged, but he never reached Jake in a flash. Jake sidestepped, grabbed Mason's arm, and flipped him over onto the pavement. Mason groaned, clutching his back. The crowd gasped. Another one of Troy's goons lunged at Jake, throwing a wild punch. Jake ducked, twisted, and landed a sharp elbow to the guy's ribs, sending him staggering backward. 2 down, the crowd erupted in cheers. They weren't here to see Jake get beaten, they were here to see justice. Troy's face. Twisted in rage, get him. The last 2 rushed Jake at once. He moved like lightning, dodging, countering, striking with precision. One of them swung a punch. Jake caught his wrist, spun him around, and sent him crashing into the other 4 down. Now only Troy was left, and suddenly he wasn't smiling anymore. The crowd grew silent. Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on Troy's. "You still think you run this place?" Troy clenched his fists, but for the first time in his life he hesitated, and Jake saw it. He smirked. "You're not worth it." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Troy standing there, humiliated, defeated, powerless. The crowd erupted in cheers, and just like that, everything changed. The fight behind the gym became the most talked about event in Brookside High. By the next morning, everyone knew what had happened. How Jake had taken down Troy's entire crew without breaking a sweat. Troy didn't show up to school that day, neither did Mason or the others. For the first time in years, the hallways were free of their bullying. No one got shoved into lockers, no one had their lunch trays knocked over. The fear that had ruled the school for so long was gone, and it was because of Jake. People started looking at him differently. Some whispered in awe, some nodded in silent respect. Even those who had once laughed at him now stayed out of his way, but Jake didn't care about any of that. He hadn't come here to be a hero. So when he walked into the library that afternoon, he was surprised to see Mr. Reynolds waiting for him. The teacher gave him a knowing smile. "Heard you made quite an impression yesterday." Jake shrugged, "Did what I had to do." Reynolds nodded. "Studying him, you know?" "I looked up your father." Jake tensed. He had never talked about his father to anyone at this school except Reynolds. He was a legend. Reynolds continued undefeated in his prime, but he disappeared from the fighting world. No one knew why Jake looked down. He left because of me. Said the world of fighting wasn't what it used to be, that people only cared about destruction, not discipline. Reynolds leaned back, folding his arms. "And what about you? Do you fight for destruction?" Jake exhaled. "No, I fight to end fights before they start." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Then I think your father would be proud." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent years wondering if he was living up to his father's expectations. Hearing those words, especially from someone like Reynolds, meant more than he cared to admit. But the peace at Brookside High wouldn't last forever, because Troy wasn't the type to accept defeat, and he was planning a comeback. Days passed, and Troy was nowhere to be seen. The school felt different. Lighter students who once lived in fear of his gang walked the halls freely. Laughter replaced tension. Jake, however, knew better than to believe it was over, and he was right. One afternoon as he left school, he heard footsteps behind him. Not just one set, multiple. He sighed. "Took you long enough." Turning around, he saw Troy and Mason standing there, but this time they weren't smirking. They weren't even trying to intimidate him. Troy clenched his jaw, looking at the ground. I was out of line." Jake raised an eyebrow. Mason exhaled. "Yeah, we were all idiots." The words hung in the air. It was clear this wasn't easy for them. Troy took a deep breath. "Look, I'm not saying we're going to be friends or anything, but you proved your point." He swallowed hard. "You were right, I don't run this school." Jake studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Troy scoffed, shaking his head with a smirk. "Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson without another word." He turned and walked away, Mason following behind him. Jake watched them go, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. Finally, he muttered, Brookside High had changed, the bullies had been humbled, and Jake, he could finally focus on what he came here for. Living his life in peace, or at least until the next challenge came his way. Jake's story wasn't just about fighting, it was about standing up for yourself. Even when walking away seems easier, bullies rely on fear, but the moment you stop being afraid, they lose all their power. What do you think? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this.